Good afternoon. We are delighted that all of you have joined us today. I am Leanne Potter. I direct the Office of Professional Learning and Outreach Initiatives at the Library of Congress. And I'm here with my colleague, Jeff Urbin, from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York today. And we are delighted to have this opportunity to visit with you and talk with you specifically about resources from the Franklin Roosevelt Library and Museum and the Library of Congress related to FDR's DDay Prayer. It is our understanding that last fall, the World War II Memorial received funding to add the text of the DDay Prayer to the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and that it will be at the memorial beginning in the summer of 2022. And we thought today we could give you a little background about the prayer as well as some resources you might use in your classrooms related specifically to it. And I'm going to stop and let Jeff take over. So Jeff, Urbin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York, located about an hour and a half north of New York City in the beautiful Hudson Valley. And we are the world premier center for the study of Roosevelt. So if you're interested in the Roosevelt era, this is the place to come. And as Leanne said, we have all kinds of resources that you can use to learn about the Roosevelt era. Now, we have about 17.5 million pages of documents in our collection, and among that is none other than the DDay Prayer. And I am delighted to be here today to talk with you a little bit about the DDay Prayer. And I want to set some context first for what D-Day was and how this prayer came to be. Now, D-Day was the largest amphibious attack in world history. And it took an enormous amount of complex planning to make this happen. First, they had to decide on a plan. The United States wanted to do a direct attack into the heart of Germany. The British felt that we weren't ready to do that and that we needed to sort of nibble around the edges and then permeate the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. And the Russians, who were really taking it hard on the Eastern Front, just wanted us to do something. So D-Day was really the culmination of a series of battles and smaller amphibious operations, starting with Operation Torch in North Africa in November of 1942, Operation Husky into Sicily in September of 42, Operation Avalanche in Italy in 1943, Operation Bolero, which was the buildup of the men, the machines, and the material in the southern part of England necessary for the D-Day invasion, Operation Roundup, which was just getting across the actual channel, and Operation Pluto, which was the laying of two oil lines under the English Channel to supply the advancing armies. This all culminated in Operation Overlord. And these operations that led up to this were very important because what they did was they allowed for an awful lot of learning of very valuable lessons that were necessary to make the attack successful. First thing they learned about was landing craft, and as you can see, I'm kind of positioned here in a Higgins boat. These boats were very important for getting the men and the material onto the beaches. They also learned that we needed to have seasoned soldiers, that we were going to go right into the teeth of the Nazis, and you couldn't have green soldiers and sailors and airmen doing this. They had to be battle hardened. They also learned that the need for secrecy and surprise was so critical, and we'll talk in a moment about how that came into play. And there also needed to be inter-alliance cooperation, super duper important. Now, Eisenhower was involved in one way or the other in almost all of these operations that I spoke about a moment ago. And he had learned these valuable lessons the way no one else had. And Roosevelt really trusted him. That's why he put him in charge of the operation. And the operation itself, of course, the largest amphibious attack in history, included thousands of ships and airplanes, hundreds of tons of supplies, tens of millions of gallons of fuel, over 2 million military personnel involved. And only a few times of the year would offer the proper combination of weather, tides, and moonlight for the attack to take place. Now, it was originally scheduled to be in May of 1944, but the time frame and schedule had shifted. The next opportunity would be in the beginning of June. In fact, June 5th looked to be the perfect day in terms of weather, tides, and moonlight for the advance to take place. But what happened was a storm moved in, and it made conditions unfavorable for the attack. There were rough seas, low visibility, and the impossible flying conditions. So they were monitoring the weather, and they discovered that there was likely to be a 20 to 36 hour break in the storm, and that's when Ike decided to go forth with the attack. Now, the Germans had made 3 fatal errors. The first was that Hitler, who had been having trouble sleeping, left orders that he was not to be woken up if he was to fall asleep. And in fact, he slept through almost the first 12 hours of the attack. Rommel, who was in charge of protecting the Atlantic Wall, his wife was celebrating a birthday back in Paris, and he left the front, the Atlantic Wall, to go back to Paris to give her a pair of shoes for her birthday. And the Germans, monitoring the storm conditions as well, suspected that it was impossible to have an attack during this time, so they let down their guard. And that was exactly the time that Ike decided to make the attack. And it all started with the simple words, "Let's go." And all of this planning, years and years in planning, millions of men, tons of supplies were set into motion. Now, Roosevelt, calling upon all of the years of planning and preparing, had turned over the decision to launch the attack to the folks in the field. In other words, Eisenhower. And the weekend before the attack, he had gone to his friend and advisor Paul Watson's Virginia mountain home, along with his daughter Anna and her husband John Bottentier, and they drafted the announcement for the D-Day invasion. And the announcement was done in the form of a prayer. Now, this is very important. It wasn't done in the form of a fireside chat, as FDR had grown accustomed to addressing the country. And in those fireside chats, he followed a very predictable formula. He would lay out what the problem was, he would lay out what his solution was, and then he would lay out what he wanted the American people to do to support him in that solution. But this address to the American public, and in fact to the world, was meant to be a solemn moment of national unity. The planning and the preparing was now being put into action, and control of the unfolding events were as out of Roosevelt's hands as they were anybody sitting here in America. It was now up to the folks in the field, on the beaches, in the boats, in the airplanes, to make the attack successful. So what he was trying to do with this prayer, this public pronouncement, was to bring the unity of all that planning and all those men and material and supplies down to a single moment of unity, led by him with the American public, so that they could stand, at least in spirit, with the brave young Americans, British and Canadians and other allies who were going on to the beach. Now, to ensure that the prayer brought about this unity, it was actually released beforehand, and it was printed in the newspapers, and I think Leanne is going to share some examples of that with you. It was printed as flyers, as posters, and it was made available prior to the president reading it on the evening at 10 p.m. The prayer is a solemn and formal moment. It's not folksy, it's not light, as FDR generally was in the fireside chats. It laid out clearly what was at stake. You know, the president says, our Almighty, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor to struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. No less than that was at stake in this attack. The president described flatly how difficult the fight was going to be, and that it would involve some of these young men never coming back. They were going to give their lives in this attempt to take back Europe from the Nazi claws. FDR also explained just how right the cause was. And if you read the speech, it's striking how simplistic and straightforward it actually is. Roosevelt also warned that the victory wasn't certain, that it could go the other way, and that if it did, we would be back, because the cause was just so right and so important that it couldn't be left to be abandoned. And finally, Roosevelt pulled together the work and the worry and the hope and the hard work and the planning and preparation, and asked all Americans to be in that moment in prayer with him, and place the outcome of all that effort into the hands of the Creator. It was a moment of unity rarely ever achieved prior or since, and the prayer lived on as a reminder and a call to action throughout the rest of the war. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Leanne at this point.
Hey, thanks so much, Jeff. That was just a perfect overview. And what I wanted to share today were some resources that are available from the Library of Congress. And please let me preface this with the FDR Library has tremendous resources related to the entire Roosevelt administration. And I know that in our Q&A later, Jeff will have an opportunity to share some more about what's available. So what I'm going to focus on are some resources that are available related specifically to D-Day as well as to the DDay Prayer that are in the collections of the Library of Congress. And I don't want to take for granted or assume anything about what you already know or don't know about our Library of Congress, but what I thought I'd start with is just a quick overview of the library. The Library of Congress is on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. In fact, there are 3 buildings on Capitol Hill that comprise the library's Washington campus. The library also has facilities out in Culpeper, Virginia, and a storage facility at Fort Meade up near BWI Airport. But for those of you who visited Washington before, many of you are probably familiar with the library and familiar with the historic Jefferson Building. And all of the resources that I'm going to describe for you today are in the library's collections. The library is the largest library in the world, and the collections come in a huge variety of media. And the examples that I'm going to share with you today are certainly examples of those media. The resources I'm sharing, by the way, are ones that are available online. And the reason I want to kind of clarify that is that Our Library of Congress holds literally hundreds of millions of objects, and a small fraction of the whole is available online. And I say small fraction, but I sort of laugh when I say that because something like 38 million objects have been digitized and are available online, but those 38 million really are just a portion of the whole. So the ones I'm sharing with you really are available. They're available online so that you can download them, you can use them with your students. And the first one I want to start with is an item that comes from the library's Rare Book and Special Collections Division. And that object is a printed version of the DDay Prayer. And as you can see, it's 4 pages long, and this particular version of it is made to look almost like a very historic document. The font choice is interesting. It almost looks biblical, and the story behind this particular object is that it was printed after the fact. It was printed almost as a commemorative item. And if you go to that URL that I've got up on the screen, you will find all 4 pages in full color, downloadable in a number of different file formats, and additional bibliographic information about this particular source. So the prayer itself, obviously, a printed version of it, is available from the library's Rare Book and Special Collections Division. The next item I want to share with you is an interesting collection of photographs that is also available online from the library. If you go to this URL, you go to loc.gov/pictures/collection/FSA, what you're going to come to is a Farm Security Administration, or the FSA became the Office of War Information during World War II. These photographs that comprise a particular lot, and in fact, if you notice what I did here when I did the search, this is what the page looks like. So if you go to the page and you do a search on simply D-Day, what you'll find is more than 2,000 photographs that specifically have some relationship to D-Day. And if you narrow it down even further, what you'll find is that on D-Day, there were photographers working for the federal government in Washington, D.C., who were directed to go out and take photographs of the American people in Washington, people in New York, and what it was that they were doing on D-Day. And it is striking to see in these photographs the various gatherings of individuals. You see images of people in Times Square. You see images of people in their synagogue. You see people in cathedrals, in churches, coming out of worship services, in large gatherings. And it's an interesting look at D-Day because I think, and Jeff, you can certainly speak to this, that most of the photographs, when we think about D-Day, the images we see are like those behind you. And it's interesting to think about what D-Day was like for the American people, because when news broke about what was happening, there was certainly a reaction and a need to know more. And so what occurred later in the day with the prayer that Jeff has described is really a part of this much larger story. And I think these photographs really serve to tell that larger collective story, just like Jeff was talking about, that I think is important for our students to think about periodically, that there are moments in our nation's history when we are having a collective experience, and everyone's experience is a little bit different. And the more we know about those experiences, the more complete the historical record is, and the better our understanding of events can be. And with that, I'm going to move on to my next item. And my next item is a reminder of the library's Veterans History Project. And I'm sure that many of the educators out there are very aware of the VHP. Within the Veterans History Project are oral histories and other collections of individuals who served in our nation's military. And for the 60th anniversary of D-Day, for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, and for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the VHP created specific collections on the Veterans History Project website that might be of real interest. And I've got one of them up on the screen so you can kind of see how they're laid out. They're laid out by individuals, and not only is the individual's name there, but what branch of service he or she served in, as well as information about what their particular collection includes. And from every one of these, you get individual stories from people who were there. And they are sharing their firsthand description of their experience and their reflections on that experience as well. In addition, so far, I've told you about the item in Rare Book and Special Collections. I've told you about a small collection of photographs, and of course, a reminder about the Veterans History Project and the oral histories and other materials that are available. The next thing is Chronicling America. Again, an amazing resource for so many topics. Chronicling America is a partnership between the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize historic American newspapers. And these newspapers, most of them, they're subject to copyright restrictions, so we don't usually get to go much past 1923, but I'm really delighted to share that a couple of years ago, the Washington, D.C. Evening Star collection was digitized and made available online, and it does extend our access to historic newspapers a few more decades. And the Evening Star does, in fact, include June 6th, 1944. On the very, very first page of the newspaper, you can see here on my screen, I've got two images up. The first one, again, if I go to chroniclingamerica.loc.gov and I do a search on June 6th, 1944, I will get the Evening Star, and if you need the exact URL, I've got it on there as well, even though it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo when you get to the end. But as you can see on the screen, on the front page of the Evening Star, on the far left-hand side, the text of the President's prayer. And in addition to the text of the prayer are instructions, essentially describing exactly what Jeff just said. This was the explanation that said at 10 o'clock tonight on your radio sets, the president is going to be there, and he is going to be not just reciting a prayer, but he is asking all Americans to pray with him. And this ask is just, it's almost, there's such an acknowledgement on the part of Roosevelt that the American people are concerned and care so deeply about what is happening over in France, and to allow them to have a collective moment where voices in American households are saying the same thing in unison, you can't help but get some goosebumps and get a little choked up about this understanding that collective experiences that are positive at a moment of such concern was so needed. And again, just the fact that what Jeff said was that, how unusual this was, that what the president was going to be sharing was shared first in print, in newspapers. And, I'll bet many of you have access to other newspaper collections from your own communities. It would be interesting to see if your local newspaper also carried it. My understanding is that is exactly what happened. And the one that's available through Chronicling America just happens to be the DC Evening Star. But I bet you could find a local version as well. And then finally, I wanted to share with you Congress.gov. And for those of you who haven't poked around Congress.gov, wow, this is a resource. If you want to know anything about current legislation, the activities of Congress, this is the place for you. And the reason I bring this up in particular is because if you were to do a search within Congress.gov on House Bill 2070, from the 112th Congress, or you were to do a search on House Bill 2175 from the 113th Congress, or Senate Bill 1044 from the 113th Congress, you would see the evolution of the act of Congress that is enabling the World War II memorial to add the text of the D-Day Prayer to the memorial. It began with a piece of legislation, and within, this is my favorite part of Congress.gov, is that you can actually track a bill. So in this case, you see that this first House version of it passed the House, but then nothing else happened. And then this one, it was introduced in the House, but nothing happened to it. However, a Senate version of it was introduced, passed the Senate, passed the House, went to the president, and became law. And if you're on the page, you can get information that includes not just a description of the bill, but you can get the entire bill text, as well as who introduced it and its whole history, as well as additional bills associated with it. So again, Congress.gov is a terrific place to explore the legislative process and to understand how things like this come to be. And I think this is a really great example of how you might use Congress.gov to take a look at something that's happening in a way that helps students understand why and how something comes to be. So with that, I'm going to sort of wrap up and say Jeff and I are here, and we are looking forward to taking your questions about everything we've discussed so far, as well as any other questions that you may have related to the FDR Library and its collections, or to the Library of Congress and its collections, as well as strategies that both Jeff and I might use if we were in the classroom and had access to these kinds of resources with our students, and approaches we might take to primary source analysis, as well as just some research strategies. Jeff, anything else, or should we just go to Q&A?
I think we're ready to just go to Q&A. Let's find out what folks are interested in, and we'll give you our responses.
Sounds great. Thanks.